This is Mike Tatarsky, host of the Vietnam Weekly podcast, coming to you from Ho Chi Minh City. I also write the Vietnam Weekly newsletter, which you can find at vietnamweekly.substack.com. I realized I hadn't included that in an intro before and should probably mention it in case people find the podcast separately from the newsletter. Last week's episode of the podcast centered on Vietnamese history, a subject I rarely get into, and today's show is sort of in a similar vein. It's about the situation in the EC, or the South China Sea, as it's called internationally. While this topic is hugely important, it receives tons of attention from major global news outlets, and I don't think I have much to add in terms of insight or analysis. Generally, in the newsletter at least, I try to write about issues that maybe don't get as much attention globally. Thankfully, today's guest has insight and analysis on the South China Sea in spades. Greg Poling is director of the Southeast Asia Program and the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. He's also the author of the 2022 book, On Dangerous Ground, America's Century in the South China Sea. We discussed the current situation in the EC, which has been dominated by tensions between China and the Philippines in recent months, Vietnam's major ongoing effort to expand the islands it controls, and China's silence on the issue thus far, the current U.S. position in the vital waterway, and the state of relations between smaller claimants overshadowed by the sheer size of China and its might, and more. As always, if you have any comments, feedback, or guest ideas, get in touch at matatarsky@gmail.com. Let's get to my conversation with Greg. Greg, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
Sure thing. So I thought we could start by maybe just having you kind of quickly describe the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative and what you guys do.
Yeah, so AMTI, as we call it, has been a program at CSIS, at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, since the end of 2014. I've been directing it since late 2015, and we employ open source intelligence to keep an eye on South China Sea, East China Sea, and disputed waters in the Indo-Pacific overall. We're probably best known for our commercial satellite imagery analysis, especially China's island building campaign, but we also do a lot of vessel tracking and mapping and really whatever we can think of.
Okay, gotcha. And we'll be talking about a fair amount of that with a focus on the South China Sea, or I should note, EC, as it's called here in Vietnam. I always have to add that. But before we get to Vietnam more specifically, I think listeners will probably be aware of the tensions between China and the Philippines in the sea more recently, which I don't think we need to cover really in detail here because it's gotten a lot of coverage already. But are there any other big issues in the South China Sea that maybe haven't been getting as much attention?
So, we still have the chronic irritants to the Southeast Asian claimants, particularly Philippines and Vietnam. So you still have China Coast Guard vessels patrolling around every oil and gas development, including Vietnam's at the Nam Can San field or Vanguard Bank. You still have the militia, hundreds of these boats that sit out there. A lot of that's faded into the background, partially because the Philippines and Vietnam don't talk about it as much. They prefer to quietly monitor it. But mainly because these high-profile run-ins at Second Thomas Shoal and Sabina Shoal keep getting all the news. But we should keep in mind that this, there's both a acute problem in the South China Sea and there's the chronic problem. And whenever, 6 months from now, if we're never talking about Sabina Shoal again, it doesn't mean that you won't still have these problems with Chinese violations of its neighbors' waters.
Mm. So you mentioned Vietnam and the Philippines have kept some of this, or they've been more quiet about this, which I think we'll also get to on the Vietnam side. Did they used to be more vocal about kind of encounters with, Chinese vessels or things like that?
Yeah, kind of when those things were new and cute and a real shift in strategy. So 2021, you had the militia kind of burst onto the front pages of the newspapers for the first time because both the Philippines and Vietnam were publishing photos and videos of hundreds of boats, Chinese militia boats, hanging out at Whitsun Reef. And that continues to be an irritant, but the Philippines mainly monitors them using unmanned platforms now, AIS buoys. They issue a weekly report on how many ships they spotted, but they don't really make a press spectacle out of it, largely because I think they realize that these things are just irritants. They're not actually arms of China's coercion the way that the Coast Guard and the more professional militia are, which are the ones that block resupply and all of that. Same is true on the oil and gas front. There was a ton of attention around Chinese harassment of, say, Vietnam's drilling near Vanguard Bank in 2018 and 2019. And in some cases, that caused Vietnam to cancel contracts, most spectacularly Repsol's contract in 2018. Since 2022, I guess, Vietnam has expanded the drilling operations at Nam Can San, and there's been a daily Chinese Coast Guard patrol around that. In fact, China set up a whole new patrol route at Vanguard Bank just to harass that Vietnamese drilling. But you hear almost nothing about it, and it's because Vietnam realized that China can't actually stop them, and so they just go about their business.
Okay. Well, pretty important for Vietnam's, I guess, future energy plans as well. Okay, so that's a little bit of a broader picture. I guess, again, get to Vietnam shortly, but I don't think we can talk about the South China Sea without also mentioning the U.S. stance or involvement. I mean, especially regarding the Philippines, since they have a defense treaty. So what's your kind of assessment of recent U.S., announcements or actions in this area?
Well, I think it's always important to preface this with U.S. stated interests in the South China Sea really haven't changed since the 1990s. It may be the best encapsulation of those interests was Hillary Clinton's speech when she was Secretary of State way back at the 2010 ASEAN Regional Forum in Hanoi. Peaceful resolution of disputes, protection of U.S. allies, and defense of freedom of the seas. Those are always the same U.S. interests. What's changed over time has been how large a threat China represents to those things. A lot of the activity we see, the very visible U.S. activity over the last 2.5 years, is because the Philippines and the U.S. are increasingly in alignment on those issues. So you started to see this shift toward the end of the Rodrigo Duterte administration in the Philippines, probably 2021, but it clearly accelerated after July 2022 when Ferdinand Marcos Jr. took office and moved to quickly deepen the alliance with the Americans, welcome a lot more U.S. and other allied, Japanese, Australian, etc., support in the South China Sea. And that's caused this real renaissance, which, by almost any metric, the U.S.-Philippine alliance today is closer and more robust than at any point since at least 1975.
I guess the big looming question, which nobody wants to see the answer to, is what would actually happen if conflict broke out, I guess, especially involving the Philippines. But moving on to Vietnam specifically, so back in June, AMTI, so I suppose you and your team published this article or analysis about Vietnam's ongoing island expansion efforts in the East Sea, noting that, Vietnam, so I'm just looking at the website now, had brought their islands in the sea to about 2,300 acres, almost half the size of China's, which is a huge expansion from, 3 years ago? Vietnam only had 329 acres of dredging and landfill. You feel free to correct me if I'm mixing anything up here, but suffice to say, they've been filling in a lot of land in the islands they have in the sea. I know the Washington Post has had some reporting on that more recently and has picked up a bit of other coverage, but what's going on there?
Yeah, Vietnam has been slowly expanding its facilities for a decade, maybe more than a decade now, probably since 2012. But this new phase of expansion that kicked off in 2023, maybe late 2022, has really been a big shift. So, as you said, over the last decade, Vietnam had created something like 300 acres of artificial land spread across the 10, I think it was at that time, the 10 biggest islands that Vietnam occupied. And Vietnam has, depending on what you count as being part of Spratlys, either 23 or 27 features with 49 outposts across them. Each of these, for the most part, is not quite as impressive as, say, what China did on just its 7, but you add them all together, it's a lot of land. And then all of a sudden, in late 2022, we see Vietnam move from this slow, rather deliberate island expansion to tactics that in many ways mirror China's. Brought out cutter suction dredgers, which are basically drill heads underneath of a boat with a vacuum cleaner stuck to it. That's how China made its island so quickly. Vietnam started employing those for the first time about 2 years ago. And the result has been, as you said, as of June, we're up to almost 2,500 acres, which is about 2/3 of what China built in the Spratlys and about half of what China built overall if you include the Paracel Islands. That's continued to today. I don't have an updated count for you. Our team will update it soon. But I wouldn't be surprised if we get close to parity with China by next year. Why did Vietnam do this? Well, Hanoi has been quiet, has made no public remarks really about this at all. But Vietnam's history in the South China Sea has usually been reactive to Chinese activity. So Vietnam expanded its occupations massively in 1988 after China began to move into the Spratlys. Vietnam developed what's called the DK1 platforms off Vanguard Bank and the other submerged banks in the late 80s and early 90s as a result of Chinese oil and gas exploration. And Vietnam kicked off the first phase of its building campaign in the early 2010s because of China's increasing military activity, especially its harassment of the Philippines. So in that first phase of of island building, what you saw was Vietnam focusing on things like helipads, solar and wind power generation, some small harbors, basic quality of life improvements to make sure that if it needed to, it could keep its outposts well garrisoned and supplied by air if need be. Now this new island building campaign, it looks to me, is focused on the creation of deeper water harbors and accompanying infrastructure, along with at least one airstrip, probably on Barkhan Reef, which suggests that Vietnam now wants to forward deploy its own Coast Guard, fisheries enforcement, and maybe aerial patrol out there. I remember the China Coast Guard is at Vanguard Bank every single day of the year. The Vietnam Coast Guard has to travel a lot farther from the southeast coast of Vietnam to patrol its own waters than China does.
Yeah, and I'm assuming their ships are also much less equipped and smaller and all of that as well.
That's right. I think there was a telling response when this came to light, in part due to our report in June. The Philippine Coast Guard was asked by the Philippine media, what do you make of this Vietnamese expansion? And Jay Tariello, the spokesperson for the West Philippine Sea, as they call it, said, I'll not exactly quote him, but something to the effect of, look, Vietnam has never used its islands to harass or bully us. So, the implication being, as long as it stays defensive, Vietnam's islands are not a threat. It's not China's island building necessarily that is the core problem. It's what China uses them for.
Right. And speaking of China, obviously, so, it's not a surprise, I suppose, that Vietnamese government has been quiet about this. I don't think they exactly publicize their military strategies, or maybe their strategies, but what exactly they're doing day to day. But China, at least from what I've seen, has been very quiet. I'm not an expert on this, but it's kind of surprised me. This is in the broader context of overall ties between Vietnam and China being quite warm at the moment. What do you make of this lack of response from China, or have I just missed something?
They haven't, and there's been a series of articles in the U.S. press. The press is a strong word. The U.S. policy wonk blogosphere about this over the last few months since we published our report, including one that Zach Cooper and I published in War on the Rocks. And everybody's come around to I think a similar list of potential explanations. It's probably not one, right? It's probably a mix of those. And the difference is just where you put your priorities. From where I sit, I think there are two key explanations, and maybe one contributing factor. So the two key explanations are, one, I think that China knows that gray zone coercion wouldn't stop Vietnam, whereas China believes that the Philippines will buckle under pressure, because the Philippines has historically buckled under pressure at least some of the time. There's almost no record of Vietnam doing that, right? Vietnam fought is a generous word. Vietnamese soldiers were massacred by China in 1988 over Johnson Reef. Vietnam sent hundreds of boats for 3 months in 2014 during the Haiyang Shiryo 981 standoff, HD 981 in Vietnam. Vietnam has continued, as I said, to quietly develop Vanguard Bank and other projects despite Chinese Coast Guard harassment. So I think China must know that if Vietnam has decided, as it evidently has, that this is a military necessity, it's not going to stop because of militia or Coast Guard harassment. So if you're not prepared to use military force, there's no point in starting a gray zone campaign at all. And I also would point out to people that we underappreciate, I think, how large the Vietnamese army looms in the minds of some Chinese leaders. Remember, on the Chinese military commission, there are only two leaders in the CMC who have any combat experience, and they both got it being mauled in northern Vietnam in 1979. It's the only combat experience that PLA has, and they got their teeth kicked in.
Yeah.
Second factor is the U.S. alliance. I think it's been undoubted benefit in the case of Philippines deterring Chinese aggression, but it also has a downside. And that downside is because China views the Philippines as nothing but an American proxy. And China's rhetoric makes very clear that it doesn't think the Philippines makes its own decisions. Then it's harder for China to look for off-ramps to de-escalate with the Philippines, because China's leaders appear, for the time being, to not view this as a China-Philippines problem. They view it as a front of the broader U.S.-China strategic competition, which in a sense makes the stakes higher, right? It's not looking for a compromise with your neighbor. It's retreating in the face of American containment policy or whatever China wants to frame it as. So Vietnam, by being a non-aligned actor, perhaps the stakes aren't quite as high politically for Beijing. That makes compromise easier. And then the third, as I said, the kind of contributing factor, I think people give it too much explanatory weight, but it does matter, is that black box of the party-to-party relationship, which gives China and Vietnam, mechanisms to de-escalate behind closed doors that don't exist for any of China's other neighbors. But again, people give that too much credit because people then take the next step and say, oh, the VCP and the CCP love each other. No, they don't. I just said they mauled each other in 1979. There was no love lost between Vietnamese Communist Party officials, including To Lam and their Chinese counterparts.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the Vietnamese government always generally has to toe kind of a careful line as well, because the general public view of China is pretty dim, to put it mildly. I mean, you mentioned the 2014 oil rig standoff, but that was one of the few times in recent Vietnamese history where there's been, mass protests on the street, and that was due to China, basically. But I wanted to go back to the first part of your answer quickly. You mentioned the gray zone. Just for people who may not be familiar with that, what does that mean?
Yeah, this has become a term of art, security circles. It basically means everything short of kinetic force, or at least the way I would think of it is everything that is coercive and, escalatory doesn't meet that threshold for military force. So some people have a wider definition here. They'll say it's influence operations and cyber attacks, and I think that that's too muddying. When I say gray zone, what I mean is China intentionally ramming other vessels, using water cannons, using acoustic devices to deafen crews or lasers to blind them, dropping flares and chaff in the way of foreign patrol aircraft, trying to intentionally create risks of collision, often with a level of deniability, to say, oops, this was just a single operator who got a little too aggressive. But when you sit back and look at it in its totality, it's clear that this is a structured campaign. This is China's preferred way to throw its weight around in the South China Sea. And it relies on the other side having a lower risk tolerance, right? It basically relies on the other side to be the responsible party. If you're driving down the road and somebody suddenly veers into your lane, you get out of the way. That's what China expects other countries to do. And I think Vietnam has shown that sometimes Vietnam won't get out of the way. It'll play chicken.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are also interactions between Vietnam and China that we certainly don't hear about. It was earlier in the year at this point. I'd have to find the link, but in Vietnamese state media, there was an article about a fishing boat that had been water cannoned, if that's the correct verb, by a Chinese vessel and broke a fisherman's arm or something, which was quite surprising to see in Vietnamese media because you almost never hear about that. Maybe just a one-off, an accident, what have you, but they do happen. But I'm curious, in China's history of action in the South China Sea, is there a history of kind of really pushing hard on one claimant while kind of backing off others, or it's just so striking how tense things are between the Philippines, while otherwise, on the surface at least, no pun intended, things are relatively calm with some of the other, Vietnam, Malaysia, what have you.
There is, and not just in the South China Sea, in all of China's disputes, East China Sea and the Himalayan border. But this is a tough one to draw out because I could also provide just as many, examples of the opposite, of China pushing on all fronts in ways that are clearly undermining China's own strategic goals. But in the South China Sea, China invaded the Paracels in 1974 because it knew South Vietnam wasn't going to get any support from the U.S. It intentionally only occupied the western half of the Spratlys in 1988 because it knew that Vietnam was isolated and nobody would help Vietnam. And so it intentionally avoided provoking the Philippines, Malaysia, or Taiwan. In the immediate aftermath of Scarborough Shoal, 2012, China continued to pummel the Philippines. But, at the same time, we could look at, there was also escalation around the Senkakus in 2012. By 2013, there was escalation with all of the claimants, including up in the Himalayas. China in 2009, 2010 started harassing and ramming both Philippine and Vietnamese oil and gas exploration at the same time. So I don't know how to say with any certainty whether or not China is disciplined enough, or even if Chinese leaders are in control of day-to-day operations enough in the South China Sea to be able to say, we're only picking on the Philippines right now. More likely, this might just be the fact that there are more kind of points of tension, and so that's what you're seeing. But I'm not sure I buy that one of the real explanatory factors behind why we haven't seen more complaints about Vietnam is that China doesn't feel it can pick a fight with two claimants at once. I think it could if it wanted to.
Right. Okay. I guess kind of going off of that, so you laid out these three potential reasons for why China's been keeping quiet on Vietnam's island building so far. What are some of the risks to that stability? If obviously, of course, nothing happens between China and Vietnam or any of these countries, but if this expansion continues, not that I want to, place blame on Vietnam in any of this, but what kind of threats could emerge between the two?
Well, the island expansion is going to continue. I would imagine by early next year, we probably start to see large-scale construction of infrastructure, so we'll be able to say what Vietnam intends to build on these things. So far, it looks to me, like I said, that it's a focus on aerial patrol and naval or Coast Guard patrol capabilities. Probably a lot of sensors, too, to keep an eye on things. But we'll see. Hypothetically, if Vietnam clearly deployed offensive military platforms out to the islands, that would be extremely provocative and would probably provoke a Chinese response if Vietnam rotated combat aircraft through them. But I think all that's extremely unlikely.
Mm-hmm.
That said, it could be provocative. More likely is that Vietnam will begin to deploy more patrol vessels, both Coast Guard and maybe Navy, as well as potentially its own very small professional militia, which is probably fewer than 100 boats. And that'll just increase the frequency of interactions with Chinese counterparts. We see this in certain places, oil and gas, Philippine fisheries, where, the places where there is the most frequency of interaction tends to be the places where these incidents happen, because the Chinese Coast Guard and the Chinese militia are always going to go out there and harass others. And maybe that's relatively safe 9 out of 10 times. But the more often it happens, the more likely accidents become.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking, I know Vietnam's, Air Force is nowhere near as advanced as China, so they can't deploy the, sheer numbers of aircraft or something like that, or their fleet's older as well. But certainly if you've got planes up in the air, like you said, the higher risk of them, something happening on accident, presumably on accident. But
well, let me just on that point. I mean, one of the maybe the most worrying trend we saw over both the South China Sea and the East China Sea in the first year and a half of the Biden administration here in the U.S. was the huge increase in the frequency of unsafe air intercepts, meaning Chinese fighter jets approaching at very high speed, very, very close to foreign surveillance aircraft, which are slower, they're lumbering, they can't really maneuver that way. And so they're just sitting there praying that the Chinese jets don't clip them. And we saw this with U.S. aircraft, Philippine aircraft, Canadian, Australian, Japanese aircraft. It wasn't just an American thing. And the Pentagon here reported that you had something like 300 interactions in a year and a half. I mean, it's every day and a half this was happening. That decreased after the Biden-Xi summit in California last fall. And it seems to have stayed lower with regards to the Americans. But it seems that China is still harassing others. The Aussies had a helicopter buzzed just a couple months ago. I mentioned 2 different incidents in August with the Philippines. These are extremely dangerous because you can ram a boat and the boat probably limps away. If you hit a plane, the plane's going down. And so if you do get the enemy's patrol aircraft, covering the Spratlys more frequently, I wouldn't be at all surprised to see Vietnam begin to get the same kind of harassment that basically everybody else that flies over the South and East China Seas gets.
It might have been 20 years ago at this point, but didn't a Chinese and American jet collide at some point? Maybe not the South China Sea, but I seem to remember that happening.
Yeah, the EP-3 incident, as it's called. So that was an EP-3 patrol aircraft. Again, one of these very large, slow, lumbering American patrol aircraft operating within China's exclusive economic zone, but over international airspace in the South China Sea. And a Chinese fighter pilot got too close and accidentally clipped the wing. And the result was the Chinese fighter pilot died. And the American aircraft had to make an emergency landing in Hainan, which provoked a weeks-long diplomatic crisis with the Bush administration. And I'll point out that was at a time when we actually talked to China. We're barely talking now. So an incident like that today would be far more dangerous than it was in 2001.
Yeah. Well, and that actually leads perfectly into my next question, which, again, can't really talk about this. Some U.S. involvement, and I'm sure these conversations are had in D.C., but in the terrible scenario where China and the Philippines or China and the U.S. are in a direct shooting conflict in the South China Sea, what kind of position would that put Vietnam in? I mean, again, I know this is a total hypothetical, but I'm sure people think about this stuff.
Yeah. Well, I don't think the U.S. would have any expectation of support from Vietnam or any other non-aligned state in the region, but there probably would be an expectation of diplomatic support to one degree or another. And of course, all of this is context dependent. It's the same discussion we have about Taiwan scenarios. I mean, at the end of the day, it depends on whether or not Vietnam believes it was the Americans' fault or the China's fault, who escalated. But there would certainly be an expectation that if a U.S.-China conflict resulted from clear Chinese aggression against either American or Filipino forces, that the U.S. would receive considerable diplomatic support from across the region, including those countries that are explicitly non-aligned. But there wouldn't be any expectation of direct military support, particularly given Vietnam's famous now 4 no's and a maybe national security policy.
Yeah.
I would also expect to see Vietnam do quite a lot on its own, though. I mean, again, the history of Vietnam's occupations in the Spratlys, really going all the way back to the 50s, is one of reaction. When Vietnam sees escalation between other claimants, Vietnam moves to shore up its own position to make sure that it doesn't fall victim to the same kind of aggression.
Okay. And speaking of the other claimants, I mean, we've mostly talked about China, obviously Vietnam and the Philippines here, but, there is Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, even Taiwan has claims in the South China Sea. I believe some of them are overlapping with each other. Of course, China takes up most of the oxygen. It's, far larger and more powerful than pretty much all these countries combined, really. But what's kind of the status of the, I guess, lower level disputes, for lack of a better word, between the claimants?
So the island disputes are relatively quiet. Malaysia occupies 5 of the Spratly Islands and really only claims those 5. Brunei claims 1, maybe 2 underwater reefs that it has no intention to occupy. And Taiwan has 1 island, Ituaba, that is quite quiet. But there are ongoing tensions over the waters and airspace, which is also where most of the disputes are when it comes to the Philippines and Vietnam. It's not so much about the islands. It's about China using the islands to prevent lawful activity in the waters, the seabed, and the airspace. Indonesia has been getting harassed. Oil and gas operations for Indonesia have been getting harassed in what they call the North Natuna Sea, the part just across the line from Vietnam's Vanguard Bank, since, I think, late 2021. And Indonesia has ignored that and deployed its Navy and its Coast Guard to help protect its drilling operations. The plan there is to plug that Indonesian well, called the tuna gas field, into the Vietnamese operations at Nam Can Son and then sell it to Vietnam, where it'll presumably be used to power Ho Chi Minh City, since Nam Can Son already provides something like 10 to 12% of the electricity for Ho Chi Minh City.
Oh, interesting.
And interestingly, Zarubezhnev, the Russian state-owned company, is involved in both of those projects. So Zarubezhnev operates the Vietnamese project, and it's a minority stakeholder in the Indonesian project. Indonesia also continues to push back quietly on kind of annual Chinese fisheries operations that go down there. There's a single Chinese fleet from Guangxi that tends to go down and fish in the Indonesian EEZ every year with Coast Guard protection. But Indonesia's tried to manage all of that, kind of compartmentalize them and keep them quiet. And that's been true of the whole decade of President Joko Widodo's tenure. But Jokowi's out of office in a couple of weeks. And I think that while we won't see any radical shift under a Prabowo Subianto government in Indonesia, Prabowo will be more likely to make noise if China irritates him or irritates the armed forces. So Indonesia could, in a sense, be a bigger player in the tussles around the South China Sea in the years ahead. Malaysia, by contrast, despite Malaysia having daily runnings with the China Coast Guard around its oil and gas fields off Borneo, especially a big new field called Kasawari, the Anwar government has bent over backwards to pretend none of this is happening. And Anwar, that's not going to change unless China accidentally kills somebody. And then Anwar is going to have to explain why he's been hiding all of this from the public. Brunei always keeps quiet. I mean, that's, what else is Brunei going to do? Although it was interesting that President Marcos went down and visited Brunei and they agreed to sign a maritime cooperation agreement, which was unusual. And as for Taiwan, Taiwan is stuck in an awkward place in the South China Sea because its claims are the root of China's claims. And even though there are some important differences, it is a difficult thing for Taiwan to talk about. It's a particularly difficult thing for any DPP government in Taiwan to talk about, which the current government and the previous government are from the Democratic Progressive Party. Mm-hmm. And that's because the Kuomintang, the opposition, will use it to attack them on sovereignty. If they show any sign of compromise, they'll get attacked domestically for giving up sovereignty. So Taiwan's position is basically to keep quiet on the South China Sea. However, we are seeing a really important alignment beginning between Taiwan and the Philippines. Without the Americans in the room, you're seeing more and more interactions quietly between Taiwan and the Philippines, largely as a result of China's reaction to the Pelosi visit to Taiwan a couple years ago, where, among other things, missiles landed in the Philippine EEZ. Mm-hmm. And I think the Marcos government in the Philippines has realized they're only 200 miles from Taiwan. They have 200,000 Filipino civilians living there and a treaty with the Americans. They can't, if there were a crisis in Taiwan Strait, the Philippines would be implicated no matter what.
Right. Yeah. That all makes sense. And so kind of moving forward, obviously, none of us can predict the future, but you mentioned some, Prabowo coming into office in Indonesia. I don't know how much longer Marcos has in office, but it must be a little while. And then obviously, of course, we have the U.S. presidential election. Vietnam doesn't have elections, but will have its own national Congress in a little over a year. I mean, that shouldn't bring about dramatic changes, but still, what kind of actions or political changes potentially should people keep an eye out for in the South China Sea or around it that may herald changes or anything like that?
So Marcos is going to be in power until 2028. And yeah, the Philippines will have midterm elections next year where all the Senate's up for re-election. But I don't expect any change in Philippine policy for at least the next 4 years. And even after that, I think people overestimate the chances of any radical change because the Philippine public has become so firmly antithetical to China these days. So, views China as a kind of an irredeemable aggressive power for which no negotiation can pay dirt. So that's not going to shift. I have no idea what's going to happen in the National Assembly in 2026 in Vietnam. I think people are vastly over-interpreting this quote, turn toward China by To Lam so far. I think he's doing what every new Vietnamese leader is expected to do. But at the end of the day, Vietnam's not going to compromise 1 inch on the South China Sea, which means it will constantly be, there'll be a constant possibility of another crisis between Hanoi and Beijing. As I said earlier, the real shift may well be in Indonesia. I don't predict anything really radically shifting anywhere else, but the Prabowo government might well stand firmer on Indonesia's maritime claims, and that could bring Indonesia into more, not conflict, but, it could introduce a level of friction between Beijing and Jakarta, and it could lead, maybe importantly, to Indonesia publicly endorsing the Philippines 2016 arbitration victory, which could break open the floodgates and gives other Southeast Asian countries cover to do the same.
Okay. And then kind of winding down, I mean, what about some of the other big stakeholders in the region? I mean, I know Australia's paying more attention to Southeast Asia. South Korea and Japan, as you've mentioned, have their own claim issues with China, but, heavily invested in Southeast Asia, Vietnam especially, and other countries around here. There's the Quad and these other alliances, formal or otherwise. What are some of these other big players doing?
If we step back and kind of look at the South China Sea as just one component of this broader kind of regional tension that includes Taiwan and the East China Sea, you are clearly seeing the slow emergence of a new kind of security architecture that's not wholly American-centric, which has always been the case in the Indo-Pacific. This networking, I don't know, you get a lot of words thrown around here, the lattice work, the mesh, but in whatever you call it, you've got Japan and the Philippines just signed a reciprocal access agreement to allow Japanese live fire training in the Philippines. The first time Japanese troops will ever conduct live fire training at the invitation of another Asian state since World War II. Deepening Australia, Philippines, Australia, Japan, kind of trilateral and quadrilateral involving all of those from the Americans. The Quad, as you said, a new India defense relationship with the Philippines with the sale of BrahMos missiles, among others. South Korea is the largest commercial military provider to the Philippines. You have the Korea-Japan, U.S. trilateral. The Kiwis, the French, the Canadians, the Germans, and the Brits have all said they're negotiating access agreements with the Philippines. You have the new Philippine-Vietnam Coast Guard cooperation and maritime cooperation agreement signed. As I said, you've had Philippines-Brunei. You also had a Philippines-Singapore agreement signed. So obviously not all of these countries are in the exact same place, but all of them are increasingly circling the wagons out of a fear of long-term Chinese intentions. And I think it's particularly helpful because in many cases they're doing it without the Americans in the room, which can make it less sensitive and I think free them up to pursue their own agency, their own interests without always feeling like they get accused of being, sock puppets of an American containment policy.
Yeah. I mean, that's certainly not that I make them out to be the bad guy, but also makes it easier if the U.S., like you said earlier in the conversation, like China just views the Philippines as a U.S. puppet. So if that's not as clear, I'm sure it gives countries a bit more agency and things like that.
No, China's not always a bad guy, but if you entered a party and everybody moved away, you might get suspicious. Like China needs to, or at least Xi Jinping needs to look in the mirror and wonder why everybody seems to be moving in directions that are clearly contrary to China's strategic interests.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop. Greg, I appreciate you taking some time to talk to me today. Really interesting topics all around. I'm definitely fascinated to see where Vietnam goes with its island expansion and what kind of attention that generates anywhere, either here or certainly from China or places like that. So yeah, thanks again for coming on.
Thanks so much, Mike. Love the newsletter and the podcast. Everybody, send in more money. Keep that Substack going.
Thank you. That's it for this episode of the Vietnam Weekly podcast. Connect with the Vietnam Weekly on Threads, LinkedIn, or Instagram, and find the newsletter on Substack. Thank you so much for listening. Please rate or review the show on your preferred podcast platform. See you next week.